The modest semi-detached at 2 Blenheim Close in Mansfield, England, doesn't look like much. But until 2013, its back garden held a sinister secret. There, Susan Edwards had buried her parents after shooting them dead with her husband, Christopher. For 15 years, Susan and Christopher had kept their secret. Susan penned fake Christmas cards from her parents and told family members that the elderly couple had moved to Ireland. Meanwhile, she and her husband had pilfered a total of £285,286 from their savings and spent the money on celebrity memorabilia. And although the murderous couple might have gotten away with it, had it not been for their devotion to their collectibles, in the end, Susan and Christopher got tangled in their own elaborate web of lies. And now their shocking story has been turned into a British miniseries called Landscapers. Not much is known about Susan Edwards' early life. She was born around 1958 to William Wycherley, then 46, and his 23-year-old wife, Patricia, who was already pregnant when they married. Susan later claimed that she'd had an unhappy childhood. To the police, she said that William had abused her until she was 11. Patricia, Susan alleged, had stood silently by. As she got older, her grievances against her parents grew. In the 1970s, Susan's step-grandmother left her £10,000 that had once belonged to her maternal grandmother, and which Patricia claimed actually belonged to her. Although Susan tried to right the wrong, her mother saw by using the money to take her on a trip to America and help with the down payment on a new house. She later began to feel that her mother's ingratitude was tantamount to cheating her of the inheritance. Meanwhile, Susan's life went on. After briefly working as a librarian, Susan met her husband, Christopher, through a dating agency. They bonded over their love of memorabilia. Christopher liked military history, while Susan loved Hollywood's golden age celebrities, and they married in 1983. But as they shunned the outside world and spent Christopher's paycheck on collectible stamps and autographs, their financial difficulties mounted. They looked as though they needed money, one neighbor recalled. They dressed old-fashioned. They didn't have a car. They didn't even have a bike. One local shop owner remembered that Christopher always seemed concerned about what he spent. He was very careful with his money, she said. When you gave him the change, he'd count it penny by penny. He'd stand by the door and look at the receipt and check. According to police, Susan and Christopher figured that there was an easy way to get lots of money fast. With murder in mind, they drove to Susan's parents' house in the East Midlands for the May Day bank holiday in 1998. There, Christopher and Susan shot Susan's parents twice in the chest each, wrapped their bodies in a duvet, and buried them 3 feet underground in the back garden. The following Tuesday, when the banks reopened, Susan Edwards withdrew £40,000 from their account. But it was just the beginning. For 15 years, Susan and Christopher Edwards guarded their secret. As time passed, they made it seem like Patricia and William were still alive. I should explain that, with my father getting elderly and my mother not always in the best of health, they had been traveling around Ireland because of the good air on and off for some years, Susan wrote to a relative in 2007. On another occasion, in 2011, Susan raved that her parents were enjoying a second youth and wrote, "It is good to see them with such zest." All the while, Susan and Christopher were siphoning money from William and Patricia's accounts. They set up loans and credit cards under the dead couple's name, fake pension and disability benefits, documents, and even sold their house with a forged signature. Meanwhile, the bodies of William and Patricia Wycherley still lay underground and undetected. The money they stole didn't go into savings or real estate, however. Instead, Susan and Christopher squandered thousands of pounds on celebrity memorabilia. Once, they spent £14,000 on Gary Cooper collectibles. Another time, they dropped £20,000 on a collection of autographs. But by 2012, they started to get nervous. That year, William Wycherley was turning 100, and the Department for Work and Pensions asked for a face-to-face interview to mark the occasion. Buckingham Palace had also written inquiring where to send a telegram to congratulate the man on reaching his centennial birthday. Susan and Christopher panicked and fled to Lille, France, with their most valuable film memorabilia. However, they quickly discovered that they couldn't access the Wycherleys' bank accounts from abroad. But they refused to sell anything they'd brought with them. So, as money started running out, Christopher called his stepmother to get more. His elaborate lie would instead blow the case wide open. In 2013, Elizabeth Edwards received a strange call from her stepson, Christopher. He needed money, he said, and then he told her a shocking story. According to Christopher, his wife Susan had been sleeping at her parents' place in May 1998 when she heard a bang during the night. When Susan went to investigate, she found that her mother, Patricia, had shot and killed her father, William. From there, Christopher said, things had escalated. Patricia had mocked Susan and said that she'd slept with Christopher in 1992. Then Susan shot her mother, but Christopher didn't want to throw her to the wolves by going to the police. Susan Edwards, who repeated this story at her trial, offered even more details. Claiming that she'd hidden her crime from Christopher for a week, she said that her mother had provoked her. My mother said I was an unwanted child. She wanted an abortion. They both wanted an abortion, Susan Edwards told the court. She told me she knew that my father abused me. At some point, she threw the gun on the bed. I picked it up. She kept going on, and I asked her to stop saying these things. I asked her, please stop saying these things. Will you go away? She didn't. She kept on and on. To make her stop talking, Susan said, she shot her mother in the chest. But Elizabeth was unswayed by her stepson's story. She called the police and told him exactly what he'd said. When we received that call on October 1st, it was difficult to believe that what she said had happened could have happened, admitted Detective Chief Inspector Rob Griffin. But we took it seriously, and that is when the investigation started. The police began to dig up the garden at 2 Blenheim Close. Then, on October 9th, 2013, they found the remains of William and Patricia Wycherley. Penniless and backed into a corner, Christopher and Susan Edwards turned themselves in soon afterward. Later on today, we are going to surrender ourselves to the UK Border Force authorities at the Eurostar terminal at Lille Europe Station, Christopher wrote in an email to the police on October 30th. We would prefer to do this since my wife is already sufficiently frightened. Please, could you notify the UK Border Force at Lille Europe so that they may expect us? The police didn't buy Christopher and Susan Edwards' story. To them, the murder of William and Patricia Wycherley looked more like a calculated kill than a crime of passion. For one thing, both victims had been carefully shot twice in the torso. For another, their daughter had immediately withdrawn thousands from their bank account. And, of course, Susan and Christopher had covered up what they did for 15 years. Police suspect that it was Christopher, urged on by Susan, who pulled the trigger. After all, he admitted to having experience with guns and had even been part of a shooting club. This is a couple that appear to have planned for some years to exact revenge for the taking of inheritance that had been due to Susan from her step-grandmother. Detective Rob Griffin explained. They had spent a number of years planning how they might get some of that money back, and they decided on a course of action. They said, we will travel to Mansfield. We will kill this couple, who we know will not be missed, and take all of their money. He added, I would describe that as pretty cold and calculating. In 2014, both Susan and Christopher Edwards were found guilty. They were each sentenced to at least 25 years in prison for the double murder. It was through good old-fashioned detective work that we were able to separate fact from fiction, said Griffin. The Edwards were their own worst enemies in the end. It was in the finer detail of their own story that we were able to expose their lies. Netflix has gained quite the reputation for true crime documentaries. One of these documentaries is called Girl in the Picture, which talks about the absurd and gruesome tale of Sharon Marshall, who was abducted as a child by her own stepfather, Franklin Delano Floyd. One stormy night in April 1990 in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, 3 men were making their way to a motel when they spotted a shoe in the middle of the road. 200 feet further, the men made a startling discovery. On the edge of the road was a young woman lying face down in the gutter. She was taken to a hospital and died days later of her injuries. She had many aliases: Tanya Hughes, Sharon Marshall, but her real name is Suzanne Sevakis. Suzanne Sevakis was abducted as a child by Frank Floyd and raised as his daughter. He sexually abused her and forced her to marry him, and then she was killed in what Floyd claims was a hit-and-run accident in 1990. She was just 20 years old at the time of her death. Suzanne Marie Sevakis was born on September 6, 1969 in Michigan. Her mother, Sandra Willett, says she was struggling with PTSD after a tornado had hit the trailer where she lived with her children when she met Floyd. He had pledged to take care of her and her children, but had started to do scary things, such as carrying a knife with him at all times and telling Willett, "You think you're gonna leave me? That's not happening." One day, Willett needed to buy diapers for her children and wrote a bad check at a convenience store. She was sentenced to 30 days in jail. "That's when he took my children," Willett said. She says that when she went to the police, the officers asked if she was legally married to Floyd, and when she answered affirmatively, she was told she would have to handle the situation herself. While Willett was serving her jail sentence in 1974, Floyd dropped off 2 of Willett's daughters at an orphanage and left with Suzanne. She wouldn't be known as Suzanne again for another 40 years. It was during the investigation into Suzanne's son, Michael's kidnapping, that authorities learned his real name was Franklin Floyd, and that he previously abducted a girl, robbed a bank, and attacked a woman. By the time authorities connected the dots, he had been on the run for 2 decades after failing to appear in court. Joe Fitzpatrick, an FBI special agent who worked on the case, says in Girl in the Picture, "Through news coverage of Michael's kidnapping, a woman named Jenny Fisher got wind that authorities were circulating images of Tanya, saying she had recently died and of her young son who was missing. Fisher was confused. The woman identified on television as Tanya was her former high school best friend, whom she knew as Sharon Marshall. Sharon, as Suzanne was known to her high school friends, is remembered in Girl in the Picture as a brilliant, ambitious student who had been accepted to Georgia Tech and dreamed of being an aerospace engineer. Sharon's friends knew her father to be a strange man who kept a close eye on his daughter and seemed at times inappropriate with her. The man was Floyd, who had represented himself as Suzanne's dad, and called himself Warren Marshall. When authorities told Fisher years later that the man was her friend's husband, she was shocked. "They said they're married, and I'm like, no, that's her father. They're not married," Fisher says in the documentary. "And they said, no, honey, they're married." And I was like, no, that was her father. We had a portrait of very different people when it came to who Sharon was. In 1989, 1 year before Suzanne's death, they changed their names. Fitzpatrick explains in Girl in the Picture. Sharon Marshall became Tanya, and Warren Marshall became Clarence Hughes. The names they used were taken off tombstones in Alabama, and then they got married under their new names in New Orleans, which means this man married his own daughter. It was unbelievable. In the time between high school and her death, Suzanne was sexually abused by Floyd. Fisher shares a harrowing account of him raping Suzanne at gunpoint one night when Fisher was sleeping over, Floyd having threatened both girls with a weapon and forced to perform sex work. Heather Lane, a former dancer at Mons Venus, a club in Tampa, Florida that provided adult entertainment, remembers the woman she knew as Sharon as a very shy person who didn't really talk about her past and didn't talk about herself. She recounts hearing about Sharon's dad and their weird relationship. According to Lane, Sharon's dad had told her to inquire about the parties being organized at the club and to make herself available for them. One night, during an event that was supposed to involve no lap dancing and no contact between patrons and dancers, Lane says she was alerted to the fact that Sharon was in front of the women's bathroom, offering sex services to these men for $50. She said, "Well, my dad told me to do it, and he bought me condoms," Lane says. "That was disgusting. I couldn't believe that a man would put his daughter in that situation." Soon, it became apparent that Sharon was pregnant. It was around that time that she gave birth to Michael. Sharon's relationship with her son, Michael, was beautiful, Lane says. She was a wonderful mother. She was so engaged with him. And just seeing the way he looked at her, I think that was the best thing that ever happened to her. In 1995, Floyd was found guilty by a judge of having abducted Michael Hughes and handed a prison sentence. That investigation turned up photos of Cheryl Ann Comso, a friend of Sharon's who had also worked at Mons Venus. Comso's remains were found in 1995, and she was later determined to have died in 1989. Fitzpatrick contends in Girl in the picture that Floyd left Florida and married Suzanne in an attempt to evade authorities after murdering Cheryl Ann. In 1997, Floyd was charged with first-degree murder in Comso's death. He was convicted and sentenced to death 5 years later, in 2002. Floyd remains in custody at the Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, Florida. People kept trying to figure out who Sharon Marshall really was, and what had happened to Michael after his abduction. It wasn't until 2014 that Floyd answered both questions during a conversation with FBI agents in prison. According to FBI Special Agent Scott Lobb, Floyd, during a contentious exchange, told him he had killed the boy after the kidnapping. Floyd also revealed to the FBI Sharon Marshall's real name, identifying her as Suzanne Sevakis. The FBI still considers Suzanne's death as suspicious and unsolved. "That's the one thing Floyd won't talk about," Lobb stated. Authorities believe Franklin killed Sharon because she tried to leave him and run away with a college student named Kevin Brown. But her stepdad-turned-husband has never admitted to her murder. He did, however, admit to the FBI that he shot her young son Michael in the head and killed him on the same day he kidnapped the little boy from his school. He said he disposed of the boy's remains on Interstate 35, though no trace was ever found. Police believe his body may have been eaten by wild hogs. Suzanne's parents, Sandra Willett and Clifford Sevakis, are both still alive. They were both informed of what happened to their daughter after the discovery was made, and they both share their stories in Girl in the picture. Their narratives highlight what made the family vulnerable to Floyd. Willett, a divorced mother struggling with PTSD following the tornado, who tried in vain to get help from social services when she became unable to care for her children, and Clifford Sevakis, a young Vietnam veteran still kind of messed up from the war, who didn't feel any more able to be a parent. Suzanne became pregnant 3 times in her lifetime. One of her children was Michael Hughes, and another was Megan Dufresne, Suzanne's biological daughter placed for adoption in 1989. Dufresne explains in the documentary that learning her birth mother's story has left her feeling a strange kind of anger, which she's still trying to process. "No girl should have to go through that," she says. From a stranger, much less somebody's that's supposed to be her father figure, whatever the hell he was. Dufresne has named her own son Michael after her late brother. In 2017, Suzanne's tombstone, which until then had always read Tanya, was changed to reflect her true identity. Fisher, Dufresne, and Dufresne's grandfather, Clifford Sevakis, are all seen together in Girl in the picture for the unveiling of the new gravestone, which identifies her as Suzanne Marie Sevakis. When Jessica Patel found out she was going to become a mom after 3 failed rounds of in vitro fertilization, it seemed that her dreams had finally come true. But the happy news sealed her fate. Within days, she was brutally murdered by her callous husband, who planned to steal her fertilized embryos and begin a new life in Australia with his gay lover. Pharmacist Mitesh Patel, then 37, also planned to cash in a £2 million life insurance policy and tried to cover up his crime by staging a burglary at the couple's Middlesbrough home. But in December 2018, 7 months after the horrific crime, he was jailed for life for strangling and suffocating his 34-year-old wife. Jessica's 2 sisters, Divya and Manal, stated they had no idea that Mitesh was abusing Jessica throughout their 9-year marriage until details emerged at the trial. Divya says, "When we found out how he was treating her behind closed door, you feel an enormous sense of guilt that someone who was as kind and gentle as Jessica had suffered. Why couldn't I have protected her better? It's hard because someone as nice as her deserved so much better. This shouldn't have been her fate." The wedding photos from July 2009 show a stunning bride in a beautiful sari, beaming with happiness as she poses alongside her new husband. Jessica and Mitesh started dating while studying pharmaceuticals at university, and he seemed the perfect boyfriend, showering her with romantic gifts and cuddly toys. When he proposed in 2009, the family thought it was too soon, but Jessica persuaded them. Mitesh and his family, strict Hindus, were keen not to wait. Jess was always very patient and calm, says Divya. She was always fun to be around. She had a great sense of humor, liked to be silly, but she was also quite girly. We used to watch a lot of Bollywood movies when we were younger, and there was always a boy and a girl falling in love. Some romantic love story. She always fantasized about falling in love and having a family. The couple's lavish wedding in the garden of Jessica's family home in Leeds seemed the perfect start to their new life. But groom Mitesh was hiding a dark secret and already leading a double life, hooking up with men on Grindr behind his new wife's back. The marriage was merely a sham to hide his true sexuality from his religious parents and the wider Hindu community. Within a year, Jessica's family began to notice cracks in the relationship. She told her sisters she felt neglected by Mitesh, and that, after being attentive before the wedding, he had backed off as soon as they were wed. Cousin Gayatri Patel said. She mentioned that they had not had a sexual relationship for 10 months. That came as quite a shock. They'd not been married long at that point. At the same time, he became increasingly controlling. When her terminally ill granddad was put in palliative care in February 2010, the family kept a vigil by his bedside, but Jessica, who was close to him, only made fleeting visits. Sister Manal says Jessica told her, "Mitesh won't let me stay." She adds, "She said they had gotten to an argument in the car over it and he had hit her." Jessica also told her sisters he sometimes throttled her and was constantly secretive. If he was on the phone when she walked into the room to go to bed, he would walk out and continue the conversation in one of their loft rooms upstairs, says Manal. He wouldn't come back down to bed sometimes until 4 a.m. Within 2 years of the marriage, Mitesh began a passionate affair with Dr. Amit Patel, who he met on Grindr. Cruel Mitesh even invited his lover to stay, introducing him as a friend. Soon afterwards, Mitesh announced he had bought a pharmacy business in Middlesbrough, and the couple were moving 60 miles from her family. Desperate to make the marriage work, Jessica saw the move as a fresh start. But Mitesh continued to see Amit and was still active on gay dating apps. Pressure was also mounting on the couple to have a family, and, after 6 years in a sexless marriage, Jessica agreed to try IVF. Chillingly, Mitesh was already plotting to start a family with his lover, using his wife's embryos. Texting Amit, he told him Jessica was undergoing IVF and asked, "Will you stand by me?" Amit replied. She might not even get pregnant. We'll deal with it when it happens. Mitesh also hinted that Jessica would cease to stand in their way if she went earlier than you think. In 2016, Amit emigrated to Australia, and Mitesh began to fantasize about a new life with his lover down under. He even texted his lover, "I'm telling you, her days are marked." Pushed into 3 rounds of IVF in 2 years, Jessica found the process heartbreaking and exhausting. After each failed attempt, she said to me, "I can't do this. It's too painful." Her mental health suffered. It was quite a struggle, says Manal. She suffered with anxiety and having regular panic attacks. The 4th round proved a success, and on May 9, 2018, the couple were told 3 embryos had been fertilized and would be implanted the following month. On a visit to her family, 4 days later, she was bubbling with the news. She was absolutely ecstatic, says Manal. The chance to become a mother was finally on her, and her dreams were all coming true. But just a day later, she was dead. After working late at the pharmacy, on the night of May 14, 2018, Jessica returned home at 7:10 p.m. As she walked through the door, she was attacked by her husband, who forced a Tesco bag over her head to suffocate her. Before strangling her with such force, he broke the bones in her voice box. Jessica fought back, scratching his neck, but it took just 20 minutes to squeeze the life from her. Mitesh then bound her feet and hands with duct tape and ransacked the house before driving to the local pizza restaurant, where he texted his wife's phone to tell her he was picking up their order. CCTV footage from the restaurant shows the callous killer chatting amiably to staff as his wife lay dead on the living room floor. At 8:22 p.m., Mitesh called 999 from the couple's home, telling the operator, "I think we've been burgled and my wife's been attacked. I just went out to get something to eat and the house has been ransacked. She's just on the floor and she's got duct tape all over her and she's unconscious."
Police emergency.
Oh, hiya. I think we've been burgled and my wife's been attacked. Well, I've just come home. I was just out. I went to get something to eat and see the lads at work and get my laptop. And I've just come home and the house is ransacked. And she's just on the floor. She's got duct tape all over her and she's unconscious.
When police arrived on the scene, Mitesh showed them the ransacked rooms and once again claimed Jessica had died at the hands of a burglar. Even the family didn't suspect a thing, comforting Mitesh just 2 days after the murder in a visit to the house. I walked straight up to him, sat down on the sofa and went to hug him, says Manal. He immediately buried his head in my shoulder. At that point, I thought he was genuinely crying. Dad Jay added, "Why would somebody do this?" Jessica was not the sort of person who would confront anybody. But not for one moment was I thinking Mitesh could have done this. I was comforting him. I held his hand. He let me do all that. The police, however, were not so easily fooled, and a series of blunders soon led them to Mitesh. Despite his insistence of a break-in, police could find no evidence of forced entry, and a health app on Mitesh's home tracked him, running frantically up and down the stairs as he ransacked the house. A clear breakthrough came when a search of the pharmacy unearthed 4 syringes of insulin and duct tape, later proved to match the tape used to bind Jessica. The hard drive, containing CCTV footage of the couple's home security cameras, clearly showed Jessica and Mitesh were the only people to enter the house that night. 3 days after the murder, Mitesh was arrested and charged. The family, stunned at the news, had more shocks to come at the trial. When Mitesh's sordid affairs, his romance with Amit, and his incredible plot to steal the embryos was laid bare. "We only knew 5% of what came out in that trial," says Manal. 95% of what was said was a complete shock to us. There's no suggestion that his lover believed Mitesh would murder his wife. But cruel texts read out in court included one to Amit, which simply read, "Her days are numbered." He'd used Jess as a cover-up, says Manal. He described Jess as a leaseholder whose lease would one day come to an end. He quite clearly never cared for her. They also heard of cruelty on a daily basis, with pharmacy workers testifying that he called her stupid and told people she was pregnant with twins and had lost them, which was untrue. Jailing Mitesh for a minimum of 30 years, the judge said. This was a brutal attack on a quiet and gentle woman who was prepared to put her trust and faith in her marriage, despite your behavior towards her. You have no remorse for your actions. The only pity you have is for yourself. A harrowing 000 call has revealed the horror and distress of the woman who found the body of a murdered Brazilian mining executive floating in Sydney Harbor. Young, independent, and intelligent, Cecilia Haddad had just left Brazil and started an exciting new life in Australia. But on April 29, 2018, Haddad's strangled body was found floating face down in the shallow waters of Lane Cove River. When Haddad's best friends heard the news, they were shocked and devastated, but also felt incredibly guilty. Carol Camara and Rita Maciel knew Haddad was being stalked and harassed by her ex-boyfriend, Brazilian national Marcelo Santoro. Thousands of texts revealed that Haddad had broken up with Santoro about 10 days before she died, threatening she would call the police if he didn't move out of her apartment because she was fearful of his jealous and overbearing behavior. They begged her to go to the police, but when she refused, they didn't push. One time, he had forced himself into her apartment, Camara stated. She ran into the bedroom and she locked herself in. She got all the furniture she had around her and barricaded herself into the bedroom. She was shouting at him to leave and he was punching the door in. But he was telling her, I just want to talk to you. You just need to listen. The last time Camara and Maciel saw Haddad was 1 week before the tragedy when Haddad visited them in Perth. When she returned from the trip, Haddad was stunned to find that Santoro had been letting himself into her Sydney apartment after secretly cutting himself a key. Despite her friend's plea to report him to the police, Haddad was adamant Santoro would never hurt her. And with Santoro being a Brazilian citizen, Haddad also did not want him to be deported. She didn't want him to have a record. She wanted him gone, but she didn't wish him bad, Camara said. Now Camara regrets not reporting him to the police herself. I blame myself for what happened to Cecilia, she said. I would have done so much better for my friend if I knew she was in danger. Finally feeling she was safe enough in her own home after discovering Santoro had booked a flight home to Brazil, Haddad returned to her apartment for the first time on April 28, 2018. But tragically, this was the day she was murdered by her abusive ex-boyfriend Santoro. Santoro came over to Haddad's apartment early that morning, insisting to come in. Haddad refused. After waiting around her apartment block for a few hours, he used his newly cut key to let himself in. Haddad was killed a few minutes after 10 a.m. The body of the 38-year-old was found the next day by panicked kayakers who immediately called emergency services. "We've found a body in the water," Christine Baird screamed as she sobbed uncontrollably in the call. The operator adopts a soothing tone, telling Mrs. Baird to stay on the phone, and asks Mrs. Baird if she knows who the body belongs to. The response is a despairing no. "Her body is floating upside down in the water," Mrs. Baird says in a wavering voice. "I think it's a young woman. Yeah, maybe about 20. I think she's a young girl who didn't come home last night. I just feel sick for her family. I've got teenage daughters." Mrs. Haddad had been weighed down with gym weights in the pockets of her khaki cargo pants, but her body still found its way to the riverbank. Police spent months building the case against Santoro, who fled to Brazil 36 hours after he murdered Haddad. New South Wales police detectives stated they had an abundance of incriminating evidence for Haddad's murder, including CCTV cameras at Santoro's home. It's not only CCTV on the front of the house, but also out the back, Detective John Edwards told Christine Ahern. Through these cameras, they were able to track Santoro's moves in the 48 hours before the murder and straight after. Detectives also gathered accounts from friends and family about Haddad's relationship with Santoro. Edwards and his partner Hannah Packer from the New South Wales Police used mobile towers to trace Santoro's phone on the night, then matched the movement with CCTV footage gathered from homes and businesses along the way. Santoro's phone connected with a cell tower, and we can trace him driving down to the waterfront, Edwards explained, showing a tracking map. We believe Santoro drove all over, and when he didn't find anywhere appropriate, he kept driving around the waterfront, looking for somewhere to dump the body. But the overwhelming and unimpeachable evidence the detectives gathered so far was not their last hurdle. The day after dumping Haddad's body in the river, Santoro fled Sydney and returned to his hometown in Rio de Janeiro. Because Australia does not have extradition treaties with Brazil, police could not arrest Santoro and charge him with her murder in New South Wales. An international manhunt involving Interpol and Australian and Brazilian officials ended with the arrest of Santoro 3 months after Haddad's death. And it was only after 4 years, in June 2023, when Santoro's trial was heard. At a Brazilian federal court trial, where New South Wales detectives Hannah Packer and John Edwards presented evidence from their investigation, Santoro confessed to strangling Haddad to her death, but insisted it was an accident. 2 days later, the 7-person jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to 27 years in prison. The former engineer was convicted of aggravated homicide, asphyxiation, femicide, and concealment of a corpse. Santoro earlier admitted to the court he was responsible for Mrs. Haddad's death, going into disturbing detail about strangling her. He confessed to the crime on the second day of the trial. Santoro revealed he had gone to Miss Haddad's Ryde apartment without her permission, where the pair then got into an argument. He told the court he wanted to shut her up and grabbed her around the neck and squeezed very hard until she fell into his arms. She fell limp in my arms. I don't remember if she hit her head on the floor. I picked her up, desperate, and put her on the sofa. She wouldn't wake up, he said, breaking down in tears, as reported. Mrs. Haddad's mother had to leave the courtroom during Santoro's chilling admission, while her brother sat in the front row, shaking his head. Santoro, who pleaded to Mrs. Haddad's family for forgiveness, had told one of the witnesses, who is his priest, to reveal his confession during the trial. For Haddad's friends, the verdict was just a consolation. Kamara and Maciel said they didn't think Santoro has had remorse for what he did to their friend. He took away a daughter, a sister, and a friend that we're never going to have back, Kamara said. On July 2, 1995, around 11 p.m., thick plumes of smoke were billowing into the night sky from inside a hotel. Constable Abdul Nazir Kunju was posted at Connaught Place Police Station and was on night duty from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. that day. He was a man of integrity and always did things on time. He reported for duty 10 minutes before 11 and met his partner for the night, Home Guard Chandar Pal. "Are you ready for patrolling, Chandar?" Kunju asked, trying to lighten the long night of duty ahead of them. And both of them set out on Ashoka Road on patrol. By 11:15 p.m., they had reached an intersection and saw plumes of smoke emerging from the hotel compound. Both of them approached the security guard of the hotel. "Brother, why is there so much smoke coming out of the Bagia restaurant?" he asked. "We are burning old election posters." A man stopped them at the entrance. "Don't worry, it will be done soon." Being reassured, Kunju told them to be careful and left. They continued patrolling the area when suddenly they heard a woman scream, "Fire!" Kunju had left, but decided to check again when he heard the vendor scream, "Fire!" The duo turned around to see a vegetable vendor pointing towards the leaping fire coming out of the restaurant. "There's a fire in the hotel." Seeing the smoke and the large fire from over the wall, Kunju ran to a nearby telephone booth wanting to dial 100 for police and also call the fire brigade. But the telephone booth was closed. "Shander, you stay here. I am going to make a call on my wireless. I have left it on the other side of Western Court." Saying this, he rushed off. When Kunju returned, he detected a strange smell from the fire, and the flames were larger. This time, Kunju jumped over the hotel wall and saw two men fanning the large fire over the restaurant Tandoor with scraps of paper and wood. Kunju came face to face with Keshav Kumar, the manager of Bagia, standing next to the restaurant's Tandoor. "What is going on? The fire is dangerous for the hotel," Kunju screamed. "These are old political banners, paper, and posters we are burning," Keshav said. Kunju recognized the other man as the first person he had met while trying to enter the restaurant earlier. He would later be identified as Sushil Sharma, the main accused. The smell of the fire and something he saw in the fire alerted Kunju. He walked slowly towards it, afraid to acknowledge what he was looking at. It was a human torso sticking out of the tandoor. He and Shander put out the fire with buckets of water and found that it was a charred body. The skin on the lower part melted away. In an interview, he recalls, "I felt my hair stand on end. We found a human body in the embers. It seemed to be that of a woman whose legs from the side of the foot were partially burned. Her intestines spilled out." Sushil Sharma was on the run. Assistant Commissioner of Police Ashok Kumar, Additional Commissioner of Police Maxwell Pereira, and other senior officers arrived at the crime scene. The next day's headlines shocked the capital: a body being burnt in a restaurant's tandoor. And the body was that of Naina Sani. How did the beautiful 29-year-old Naina Sani get killed and burned in a restaurant tandoor? For this, we need a flashback and see her husband Sushil Sharma's rise. Sushil was born to be in politics, but he was born into a lower middle-class family, where his father was the breadwinner working as a bank clerk. Sushil had bigger ambitions. From the time he was in college, he was active on the political scene as a student leader. Many describe him as a brash and brazen man, and he rose in the ranks in the years following the emergency. The student workers of the Congress called him Shakumar Knife Slasher, as he used to slash the posters of rival student leaders on campus. His attitude grew, and he started carrying a licensed .32 revolver and was known to abduct political rivals. Sushil's name was suddenly being thrown around across Delhi student politics. Sushil rose from Students' Union President of Delhi University's Satyawadi College in 1977 to Delhi Pradesh Youth Congress chief. Sushil was a clever man and knew who to make friends with and who to keep away. He was a dedicated party worker, and it is here that he met Naina Sani around 1989. Naina Sani came from a lower middle-class background, like Sushil. What she lacked in wealth and stature she made up for with her ambition and dreams. She was always interested in politics. Her father was a storekeeper in an ordnance factory. One day, Naina and her friends were seated in the canteen of the Shyama Prasad Mukherjee College in Delhi, sipping on tea. She had just become the All India Girls Convener of National Students' Union of India. One of her friends turned to Naina and said, "You are galloping too fast, my friend. You will not find a man who is right for you." Everyone laughed, and soon their discussion turned to their future husbands, and everyone agreed that Naina was never going to be dominated by her husband. Naina left politics for a while and went off to get herself a pilot's license. But as they say, politics turns you into a hunter, and once you taste blood, you cannot stay away from it. And so she soon returned to politics and joined the Delhi Youth Congress as General Secretary in 1989. She worked closely with many leaders and party workers at Congress, and she fell in love with Matlub Karim at this time. But Sushil had already spotted Naina and made a beeline for her. "We cannot go on. My family objects to our relationship." Naina held Karim's hands in hers. Karim knew that, because of his religion, Naina's family had objected. Matlub's heart was broken. They separated but remained good friends. Meanwhile, Sushil continued to woo Naina, and she, on the rebound, fell in love with him. She found him dynamic and outgoing, confident and street smart. While he was attracted to her beauty, her confidence, and the easy charm that she had. The final decision of hers was swayed when Sushil helped her aunt sort out a land dispute. 2 years before the murder, the two were married in Delhi's Birla Mandir in 1993. But Sushil wanted to keep their marriage secret. He told his friends that I will only acknowledge marriage once I become something. Their neighbors in Pitampura remained unaware that Sushil was married. Even Sushil's father often confused the issue by saying he would like to see his son married, even though Sushil's parents attended the marriage ceremony. It was a well-kept secret. But the marriage soured immediately. Sushil liked power and dominating others, while Naina wasn't going to be submissive. She was an independent woman who wanted her own career and glory. According to Karim, his former love Naina used to call him and cry on the phone, narrating how Sushil, after getting drunk, regularly beat her and locked her up in their rented Goal Market flat. There was even an instance when Sushil brandished his gun at her and deliberately misfired to scare her. But to the outside world, Sushil portrayed himself as a soft-spoken, non-smoking teetotaler who regularly visited the Shadarpur temple, but people knew him as a ladies' man. He lived a double life. In an article when he was interviewed, Maninderjeet Singh Bitta, the Youth Congress president and Sushil's rival, says Sushil used to recruit women as office bearers. And Karim said he never refused any woman a favor. "Are you involved with Ayla?" Naina asked Sushil when he walked in through the door. She was referring to rumors that she had heard about her husband's affair with the divorced wife of a businessman. "Don't believe every word you hear. I told you earlier as well. No," Sushil replied angrily. Naina knew her husband was lying. She knew that her husband had wooed Ayla with the promise of getting her a parliamentary ticket. Journalist Archana Jeha Girdar, in her India Today article of July 31, 1995, writes that Ayla was also rumored to be the mother of Sushil's child. Naina realized that there was nothing left for her in this secret marriage. "I am moving to Australia," Naina declared one evening while sipping her Bloody Mary drink. "Why? Why do you need to go?" an infuriated Sushil asked. "I want to be independent and set up my own export business." Nana looked her husband straight in the eye. "And who will help you? Your ex-lover Karim?" She saw him clenching his jaw in anger. He glared back at her. "How does it matter?" she answered back. On July 2, 1995, Sushil had been angered by Naina's decision to leave him and go abroad. And he became more angry as he felt her proximity to her ex-lover grow. As Sushil entered the house, he saw Nana disconnect the phone and keep the receiver back. Sushil knew who his wife was speaking to. She was sipping on a drink and offered him one. Sushil walked to the telephone, lifted the receiver, and pressed the redial button. From the other end, a male voice answered. Sushil immediately recognized the voice as Karim's. He confronted Naina and an argument ensued. He pulled out his gun and fired 3 fast shots at close range. One bullet entered her neck, the second her head, and the third bullet missed her. Realizing what he had done, he knew he had to act fast. He rolled her up on the bedsheet on which she had fallen. Seeing blood seep through, he pulled the plastic cover off the dining table. He wrapped the body in it. He needed to dispose of the body. He went down from his Goal Market flat and reversed the car to the stairs. He then dragged the corpse from the second-floor flat and dumped it in the car. He went up and changed into a fresh kurta as the other one was completely soaked in Naina's blood. While driving, he came up with a plan to get rid of the body. He drove to Bagia restaurant at the Ashok Yatri Niwas Hotel, in which he was a partner and the manager Keshav was a friend. It was 10:15 when Sushil drove up to the restaurant in his white Maruti car. He rolled down the car window, and Keshav saw him run up to the car. Sushil directed Keshav to close the restaurant immediately and empty it of customers and staff. Keshav knew something was horribly wrong and better not question Sushil. When Keshav realized what was in the car, he felt nauseous. Sushil scolded him and said they had to hurry up, and he asked him to get a gunny bag. But Naina's body, wrapped in a bedsheet and lying on the folded back seat of the car, would not fit into the bag. So Keshav got a tarpaulin and dragged the body inside. While Keshav stood guard, Sushil put the corpse into the tandoor. As the body did not fit, he forced the limbs in by severing both legs from below the knees. He also chopped the arms from the elbows. The feet stuck out of the tandoor in a ghastly manner. Keshav supplied him butter from the restaurant kitchen. Sushil lit the tandoor, but he needed to get rid of the evidence faster. He asked Keshav to bring more butter. When this was not enough, both of them added paper to the fire. That is when the flames leapt up and were seen by the vegetable vendor, Kunju, and Chander. By the time police arrived, Sushil had escaped, but Kesha immediately confessed. A massive search began to apprehend Sushil Sharma. Matlub Karim identified Naina's body from her nose structure and hairstyle. The first post-mortem conducted at Lady Hardinge Medical College revealed that she died due to burn injuries and excessive bleeding. This was shocking as it changed the tone of the story as it had been revealed by Keshav. A second post-mortem was ordered by Lieutenant Governor Delhi, which was conducted by a team of 3 doctors from 3 different hospitals headed by Tireth Dogra. The post-mortem report revealed that Naina had been shot twice and died of firearm injuries, making it a murder case. Finally, the real story emerged from this second post-mortem report. This case is a landmark example of a successful second autopsy. 9 days later, Sushil Sharma surrendered in Bangalore. His head was shaved, and he said he knew nothing about the murder as he had left Delhi on a pilgrimage. And his story was that he had left Delhi on the second morning in a taxi summoned by Naina. He had driven to Ajmer, followed by Jaipur. When the cops asked him to reveal the name of the temple he had visited in Ajmer, Sushil could not and made the excuse that he had visited the temple at night and didn't know which temple it was. From Jaipur, he claimed to have taken a flight to Bombay and then to Madras. And this is where he heard for the first time that he had been implicated in his wife's murder. He immediately hired a lawyer who moved for interim bail. And then Sushil claimed that he visited the Venkateswara temple at Tirupati, where he tonsured his head and shaved off his mustache. He even presented some prasad and a ticket for prasad as proof of his visit. And after that, both he and his lawyer traveled to Bangalore and surrendered. The police knew he was lying. The case was one of the rarest when 2 autopsies were performed to determine the exact cause of Naina's death. As a matter of surprise, the 2 differed in every way possible. The first post-mortem concluded that Naina had died of excessive bleeding and was probably unconscious when she was cut up. However, it failed to establish whether her body was cut before or after her death. The second autopsy report completely rejected the first one. It said Naina had been shot twice. We found evidence of 2 bullet wounds, one in the skull and one in the neck. Dr. Bharat Singh, one of the experts who carried out the autopsy, said, police had found a .32 shell in the couple's Goal Market flat, which backed the second autopsy report. DNA method was also employed to prove and establish her identity. Sushil was convicted and sentenced to death by a Delhi court in 2003. His sentence was upheld by the Delhi High Court in 2007. Later, in 2013, the Supreme Court commuted his death sentence to life in prison. The top court had also dismissed an appeal filed by the Delhi government, questioning the premature release of Sushil granted by the Delhi court. A day after being released from Tihar jail, Sushil said he regretted what he did. I regret what I did and wish to advise others against taking spur-of-the-moment decisions. I want society to see the change in me, the former Youth Congress leader was quoted. He said he wished to go to Vaishno Devi with his parents, but they were old and won't be able to travel. My life is a clean slate now, and I have to write my ABCDs afresh, Sushil said, explaining his hopes to start afresh. On November 15, 2004, Peter Porco was found dead in his home in Bethlehem, New York. Nearby, his wife had been bludgeoned and was clinging to life. The horrific crime scene seemed to leave more questions than answers about the events that had led to the brutal attack. The pair had been attacked with an axe, and a cut screen in the garage window suggested someone had broken in. However, a short investigation quickly led police to charge a suspect: Christopher Porco, the couple's 21-year-old son. Porco was a student at the University of Rochester, nearly 4 hours away. He insisted that he'd been in his college dorm the night his parents were attacked. But surveillance footage and evidence from toll booths along the highway between Bethlehem and Rochester suggested otherwise. As the investigation unfolded, police learned that Christopher Porco had been fighting with his parents in the weeks leading up to the attack. With this information, Porco was convicted of murder and sentenced to at least 50 years in prison. Yet he remains adamant that he is innocent. Christopher Porco's disagreements with his parents, Peter and Joan Porco, began long before he crept into their home and bludgeoned them with an axe in the middle of the night. According to reports, they'd been arguing about his grades for a year prior to the attacks. Porco had been forced to withdraw from the University of Rochester after the fall 2003 semester due to failing grades. He told his parents it was because a professor had lost his final exam, and he enrolled at Hudson Valley Community College for the spring 2004 term. He was accepted back into the University of Rochester in fall 2004, but only because he'd forged his transcripts from the community college. Porco again told his parents that the lost exam had been found, and that the school was covering his tuition costs to compensate for the misunderstanding. In reality, Christopher Porco had taken out a $31,000 loan by forging his father's signature as a co-signer. He used the money to pay his tuition and purchase a yellow Jeep Wrangler. When Peter Porco found out about the loan, he was livid. He emailed his son in early November 2004, writing, "Did you forge my signature as a co-signer? What the hell are you doing? I'm calling Citibank this morning to find out what you have done." Christopher Porco refused to answer calls from either of his parents, so his father emailed him once more. "I want you to know that if you abuse my credit again, I will be forced to file forgery affidavits." He followed up with, "We may be disappointed with you, but your mother and I still love you and care about your future." Less than 2 weeks later, Peter Porco was brutally murdered. Early in the morning of November 15, 2004, Christopher Porco disabled his parents' burglar alarm, cut their phone line, and crept into their quiet suburban home as they slept. He entered their bedroom and started swinging a fireman's axe at their heads. Porco then got in his Jeep and began the drive back to the University of Rochester. Despite his devastating injuries, Peter Porco didn't die immediately. In fact, he even got out of bed and went about his morning routine in a macabre daze. A trail of blood at the crime scene showed that Peter had walked to the bathroom sink, tried to load the dishwasher, packed his lunch, and written a check to pay for one of Christopher's recent parking tickets. He then went outside to get the newspaper, realized he'd locked himself out, and somehow had the presence of mind to open the door using a hidden spare key, before collapsing in the home's foyer. When a coroner later examined him, they discovered he'd been bashed in the skull 16 times with the axe and was missing part of his jaw. When Peter didn't show up for work as a law clerk that morning, a court officer was dispatched to his home to check on him. He walked into the grisly scene and immediately called 911. Officers arrived to find Joanne Porco still in bed, clinging to life. A portion of her skull was missing, as well as her left eye. She was rushed to the hospital and placed into a medically induced coma, but not before telling one of the officers that her son was the culprit. Christopher Bowdish, a detective with the Bethlehem Police Department, questioned Joanne Porco about her attacker as paramedics were stabilizing her. He claimed that she shook her head no when he asked if her oldest son, Jonathan, was behind the attacks. But when he asked if Christopher was guilty, she nodded her head yes. However, when Joanne awoke from her medically induced coma later, she said she couldn't actually remember anything, and that Christopher was innocent. Nevertheless, police had already begun investigating Christopher Porco, and they found that his alibi for the evening was a lie. Porco said he'd been sleeping on the couch in his college dorm all night, but his roommates said they'd watched a movie in the common area and hadn't seen him there. What's more, security cameras at the University of Rochester captured his easily identifiable yellow Jeep leaving campus at 10:30 p.m. on November 14th and returning at 8:30 a.m. on November 15th. Toll booth collectors along the route from Rochester to Bethlehem also recalled seeing the yellow Jeep. Porco's DNA was later found on one of the toll tickets, proving he was indeed the person driving the Jeep. Christopher Porco was arrested for his father's murder, but he maintained his innocence throughout his trial. What's more, Joanne Porco even argued in her son's favor. In a letter, she wrote, "I implore the Bethlehem Police and the District Attorney's Office to leave my son alone, and to search for Peter's real killer or killers, so that he can rest in peace and my son and I can live in safety." Despite Joanne's pleas, Christopher Porco was found guilty of second-degree murder and attempted murder, and sentenced to a minimum of 50 years in prison. After his conviction, he insisted in an interview that his father's true killers were still out there. "At this point," he said, "I have little confidence that they will ever be caught." If you enjoyed the video, please show your support by subscribing and liking the video, and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any future uploads.